Hello, everyone. It's the Catholic CEO, Henry Katarna. Welcome to this Catholic Business Wisdom series topic today on economic systems. As a principled Catholic business owner, you need to be fully aware of what goes on with economic systems, particularly to protect your business from the trends. There's always a political overlay to an economic system that is steering it in one direction or another. And so my purpose today primarily is to show you what's going on with various economic systems and then suggest ways that you can protect your own business from the possible encroachment of economic systems that might be harmful or inimical to your business. I'm going to mention four major economic systems that have existed in the world up till this present point. But they're on a spectrum. They're not all related exactly in a clear-cut, delineated way where there's one and that's differentiated from another. They are sometimes blended and there's combinations. Secondly, there are degrees of regulation and control in every economic system. There's an economic system at play always, but there's a political system that overlays on top of it, which controls that economic system or attempts to control it and attempts to move it in a direction one way or the other. And that's the tricky part of this. For a business person, you are trying to run your business. You want stability. You want knowledge that the system is going to be in place for a period of time in the foreseeable future so that you can run your business successfully with a degree of certainty. The political system is designed, honestly, to bring uncertainty because there are always swings. The pendulum swings back and forth. We go back and forth in terms of political approaches to our economic systems. Also, because of this, there's continuous change. So let's make one more distinction before I start to dive into the four major topics. The other distinction to make is that there are degrees of regulation and control in an economic system, as we said a minute ago, engendered by the political system that overlays it. The thing is, there are free markets and there are controlled or regulated markets. Generally speaking, we have gone well past the time in history when the markets were completely free of regulation, unbridled freedom, absolutely no law or regulation about them. So it's important to understand that the degree of freedom is something that's influenced by the political system of the day. Okay, let's look now at four major economic systems throughout history, remembering once again that there are so many subtleties and degrees and time periods in which these were at the forefront or they faded away and so on. System number one, probably the original system, would be what you call the barter system. You simply trade goods and services for goods and services. So if you could think of the hunter-gatherer type economy where somebody would go out and they would hunt for polar bears, or they would hunt for mastodons, or they would hunt for some other creature for which you could provide for a family and a village and a settlement food. Sometimes a master hunter would go and would hunt and bring back a catch that's more than could be feeding the family, could be feeding a much broader group. And so he might trade then portions of the food, the meat, or the crop, if they're what we call a early days of agriculture, grow a crop, have surplus, grow the economic concept of surplus, and therefore have more to deliver to other people. And then you can trade for other services. You need to have a home, you need to have a shelter, you need to have a tent, or a log structure, or some other stone structure, whatever was in place at the time. And you would have to trade for all these things: clothing, implements, weapons, tools, transportation, might be an animal, a horse, a cow, an oxen, wagons, wheels, that sort of thing, guns, ammunition, and so on. You could see that the barter system was not currency based, We've talked about currency. But the barter system would have involved trading one item for another. And that system, if you look at history, you'll see that that system was in place for many, many years. Gradually, though, we became more involved in an economic system that was currency-based, money-based. That sort of a system also has evolved and changed over the years. An early example would be a feudal system where you'll recall a king or an emperor had a territory, had a series of strongholds, maybe one main castle or stronghold of some kind where a village or town or a city would grow up around it, and that king would be responsible then for protection for that area. And he would, of course, levy taxes, he would require service, there could be a labor-based component, there could be coins and currency introduced so that people would pay their taxes in money or in produce or in services. So this feudal system was really a first version of a capitalistic system where you had a form of enterprise. I'm not saying free enterprise, but a form of enterprise where people would live together in communities. They would grow crops, they would hunt, they would make things, they would build things, and they would perhaps use a currency that would be common to the area, and thus they would evaluate their products, supply and demand, all the things we've already talked about in this series, that would then yield some kind of an economic system. And then if the king added taxation on top of that, or duties of service, or other forms of commitment, then you had the makings of an actual economic system. You might call it the feudal economic system, but it's an early form of capitalism. And when I say capitalism, I mean a system that combines land, labor, and capital, the old classic economic theory. Land, labor, and capital. Land meaning physical land territory, labor meaning the work that it goes into producing a product and selling it, and then capital would be the money required to do that, or the savings, or the pooling of resources to get something done. Land, labor, and capital are what they call the three factors of production in the classical economic theory. So step number one, or type of economic system number one, is the feudal system that leads to a capitalistic system. Further to that, I'm going to consider the actual capitalist system in further detail now. The capitalist system gradually grew to the point where I think you could look in history, perhaps the medieval times, monasteries and territories where there was an economic system where people gathered again, but not under the feudal conditions. The monastic system led to a different, under the influence of the Catholic Church primarily, led to an economic system where people traded for using money, but they traded in a more protected way and unregulated in the sense that there was more economic freedom. Then if you move fast forward in history to, let's say, the Industrial Revolution in England, where you had the first makings of an industrial system where production was left in the hands of capitalists, people who owned a factory or an industrial process, and they hired people for wages. So you had an economic system that was changing from hunter-gatherer feudal type of village setting with a small microeconomy in a region. You had a more centralized system. So people moved into the cities. You heard of the enclosure movement. You heard of the other systems that occurred primarily in England, where people began to congregate in the big cities, and wage labor was the norm. People didn't run a hunting operation or a field operation, agriculture. They moved into the cities and they worked for hourly pay or daily pay. Now, that was a very unregulated market. That was what you'd call the unbridled form of capitalism, perhaps its worst manifestation, right? Because you had all sorts of conditions such as child labor, unfair wages, cheating, defrauding the laborer of wages, all those sinful and sort of negative aspects that we're familiar with. But the capitalist system then grew up, and gradually as that moved around the world, you had international trade beginning, you had shipping, you had trade between countries, and you had long distance trade. So the economic system was gradually shifting from a micro-based, village-based, let's say community-based, even family-based operation to a more regional-based system, where the feudal system that we talked about, or the monastic system, all the way to the Industrial Revolution, where you had a larger pool of capital, a larger pool of laborers, and then you had a larger pool of markets, customers for your products, and it became almost a global system even in that time. Gradually then, regulation came into being, and so you had this capitalist system where land, labor, and capital were combined to produce economic benefits. People sold their time for income, and they made products. In those days, you could be a small business owner and have your own business. Britain, as is said, was a nation of shopkeepers. You've heard that expression. And that has grown to the point where some people acquired large amounts of land, large groups of buildings and factories and equipment and so on. So you had capitalism growing to the point where it became a very powerful economic force. Remember, I'm not speaking here of the political forces that have driven this. I'm simply speaking about the economic system. Gradually then, we move into the, let's say, the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, even the early 20th century, when you have the introduction of some of the regulatory frameworks that we're familiar with today. And let's say in the United States, you might be familiar with this example, the robber barons, the great railway magnates, the steel magnates, and the oil and gas magnates. Those were the three major industries where you had unbridled capitalism, you had massive production of wealth, and there was a lot of exploitation. I need not go into the history, but you know of the kind of history that went on. So we started to have a regulatory system control things. So you had the idea of minimum wages, for example. You had the idea of unions, which bargained and negotiated with employers on their behalf. You had the idea of cartels, where companies would gather together and they would do things in an economic way. You had monopolies, where an individual group or an individual could control an entire industry. And you had other variations, monopsony, which is a single seller of a product, single buyer. And you had all sorts of other variations of the capitalist system. The regulatory system grows, particularly in the 20th century. You have a lot of regulation that governs not only hours of work and income and wages, but you had regulatory controls on the environment, you had regulatory controls on standards of production, you had labeling, you had branding and marketing, you had all sorts of activities, you had health standards, safety standards. And so gradually the economy became known as a mixed economy. I'm still on the second topic here. The first topic was barter. Second topic is the capitalist system. I'm going to talk about two others in a moment here. But you had gradually the growth of what we call a mixed economy, where there are some elements of heavy regulation, which means that it's not unbridled free market capitalism, it's regulated capitalism with possibly over-regulation as an issue. I won't get into the political analysis, but you can be aware, and I'm sure you're aware of the politicization of business to the point where certain standards are applied excessively depending on the political overlay at the moment. So ending up at the current time, we live in a capitalist economy in the United States and Canada. We have a lot of regulation, we have a lot of control by governments, we have a lot of control by large corporate interests, we have a lot of control by investors, we have a lot of control by stakeholder groups. It's a very mixed economy, and it's which you certainly wouldn't call it free market capitalism, you'd call it capitalism modified and controlled. So let's leave that aside for just a moment. The third type of economic system would be what I call socialism. And socialism, you could look at all sorts of definitions. One main definition of socialism is that it is the combined results of the economic system are distributed in the economy in a different way than the ownership of production would imply. So, for example, if you lived in a free market economy and you were the shareholder of a company, you might receive profit in the form of dividends, and that would accrue to you. And so you might be, if you were a wealthy person or you own a lot of shares, you would accrue a lot of wealth and a lot of income. But somebody who maybe had less ability, less education, less talent for business, less interest in business would be perhaps stuck, you might say, only working for a company and therefore earn low wages or minimum wages, and they would not have as much income. So you have this disparity of wealth, and the theories of wealth redistribution go on. And so political parties came into power and they started to distribute these proceeds through taxation, usually, from the wealthy to the less well-off, the needy. And so you'd have a socialist system where the means of production are still owned perhaps privately or in a mixed economy, sometimes owned by government, sometimes owned by private interests, but the redistribution system begins to enter the system where people would receive money through welfare payments, transfer payments, as they are called in economic terms, and they would be then given money. The dangers of this are that you can create a disincentive to work on the part of the worker. You can create a disincentive to get into business on the part of the business owner, because the profits and the proceeds might be so heavily taxed and then redistributed that you create an imbalance in the system. Now, there's always an imbalance because there's always the wealthy and the poor in every society. This is all fraught with political interests, and it's really endemic to a socialist system. You could accuse the Canadian system of being heavily socialistic now, and even in the US system there's a lot of socialism implied by some of the activities of governments. There are countries that in Europe that govern themselves in a socialistic manner where it's what you call a welfare state. So many kind of opinions about this, of course, but the idea is that there is a socialist economy where there's a redistribution of the goods and the services and the wealth and the surplus to the less well off. And it has its own good features and it has its own negative and dangerous features for society. Finally, I'll talk about the fourth economic system, which is communism, and that is an economic system where the control of the economy rests largely with, I call it the government, but sometimes it's not the government, it's a group of dictators, or it's a dictator, a single person. In the communist system, the means of production are owned by a small group of people, either the government or a cadre of individuals who have come to power and they have seized control of production. So everybody works for the state in a communist system. Everybody works for low wages, even though the ideals of communism are always preached about in terms of glowing effects on society. Those who have lived under communism can tell you the opposite story is true. Currently, just like the capitalist system has evolved, so has the communist system developed. It's no longer straight communism like the old Soviet-style communism where somebody would set the market price for a product. They would deliver a 5-year plan of a particular production of steel or grain or whatever. It led to massive problems in the economic system. It led to starvation and death. And couple that with despotic governments in control of these things, with corrupt activities, you had the recipe for the millions of people that lost their lives in the 20th century. In the current communist world, it's really a modified form of communism. Just like we have a mixed economy and it's no longer an unregulated free market capitalism, neither is it a fully regulated, controlled communistic system. In China, for example, with the 1.3 or 1.4 billion people, you can't have a command system like the old communist model very easily. You have to allow a certain amount of capitalism, and so it's done in a way that certain people with power and authority and influence and connections are granted an economic zone for them to develop in an economic system. So you in fact have a mixed communistic system as well. You have a system where under the communist system the freedom is very restricted, the economic system is controlled, but now in the time period that we're in history today, you would say that there is a development going on where communism itself is evolving to a more mixed type of economy as well. So there you have it. The four main systems: the barter system, the capitalist system with all of its incredible history, the socialistic systems, and the communistic systems. Here's the lesson for it all for us in business. It is important that you understand these economic systems and be able to spot when your political system overlaid on top of the economic system starts to push you in a certain direction. It's important for us to be aware of what the current political environment is doing to your economic system. Is it doing something that removes restrictions and liberates you and deregulates you? Is it pushing you towards a higher regulatory system where you have less and less control over running your business and so on? And so lesson number one, let us be very aware of what our current governments are doing. It's no longer possible to keep your head down and just focus on your business. You must lift your head up and look around and understand what the politicians are doing. And in each country, if you're trading with different countries, you have inputs, you have a supply chain, you have exports to all sorts of different countries. It's important for you to be aware of what's going on in those countries because sudden political moves can impact your business. So it's important that you are aware of what's going on there. And finally, I would say that the activity level, it's important that business people are involved. Lobbyists are very capable of putting their position forward. The small business community in general is unorganized. There are organizations, of course, that you can be aware of that are trying to help. But generally speaking, the small business sector is very poorly organized, and so it is less able to influence governments than other sectors. So I won't advocate for a position particularly. I will just say that it's important to protect our businesses by understanding what's going on, certainly understanding in our supply chain what's going on, and then trying to also influence things locally so that we can maintain the freedom and the ability to resist the culture by being in business where there's still a measure of independence available to us. So that's the story of economic systems, and it's something that it's a worthy subject for you to study. It's a very interesting field of study. Let us hope that you can, with your knowledge of the economic system and the various systems that play in the world, do better for your family and your business and be able to produce and create income for yourselves and wealth for your future. So God bless you all, and hope to see you next time at the Catholic Business Wisdom Series. It's the Catholic CEO, Henry Katarna. Thanks for joining me today.